Hi, welcome to my channel. Today I'm so excited because I'm going to teach you how to do my all-time favorite hobby of life, which is embroidery. Specifically, I really like to embroider kitchen towels like this. I know it's kind of bright so you're not seeing it too well. There we go. This is the exact towel we're going to make together in this video, and I'm going to do a giveaway for this towel in my next video. So if you want to have this exact one, it could be yours. But I love making embroidered kitchen towels because it's functional. I use these to dry my hands in the kitchen, and they're really pretty, but they're just very usable. I feel like we all only have so much wall space, so for embroidering or cross-stitching like wall art, it can almost become cumbersome to like collect a lot. Whereas I like to do a little bit of embroidery every single night, and I could just make tons and tons and tons of towels. I just think this is like a perfect craft if you really want to take up like a cozy, soothing hobby. Embroidery has my heart, and maybe it'll have yours too. So we're gonna make this one. It's a key lime pie towel. Comes from the set Aunt Martha's number 4036 slice of pie. It's all these fun pie patterns. So if you want to follow along and make exactly what I'm doing, I will post everything down below. This pattern, the colors of thread that I use, the towel that I'm using, everything. Or if you want to follow along and do your own thing, you can do that too. I'm just going to teach you the mechanics of embroidery. It's very simple. I promise you can do it. If you can trace, you can embroider. It is as easy as tracing with a needle and thread. So you can totally do this. And you can pick a simple pattern. I will put some pattern suggestions down below that are really simple. This one has a little bit more going on, but it is doable. And there are so many options, and it's so much fun, and I just hope maybe you'll love it as much as I do, and you'll want to join me for this. So let's dive in. Okay, so I want to quickly clear something up because a lot of people get confused between cross stitch, which looks like this, and embroidery, which looks like this, and the type of embroidery we're going to be doing today, which looks something like this. So cross stitch is done on this fabric called Aida that has these tiny little squares, and each stitch is a little X. That's why it's called cross stitch. And it makes this really cool look where it all looks like it's filled in, but it's made out of tiny X's, almost like little pixels. So that's not what we're going to be doing in this video. It's a very fun craft, but it's also a lot different. I personally think it's a lot harder than embroidery. So if you want to look into it, absolutely go for it. I made this and I thought it was really fun. I love doing cross stitch, but it's not as relaxing for me because you have to think a lot more. You have to count out the squares and figure out where you're supposed to stitch based on your pattern. As compared to embroidery, where you can iron on a pattern directly onto the fabric, which I'm going to be showing you, and then it's just a matter of basically tracing. So something like this. This is a beautiful wall hanging my friend actually made, and this type of embroidery is using almost entirely satin stitch, meaning it's like all filled in. You see it's not like an outline like on the towels. So this is a slightly different style of embroidery that we won't be doing for today's video. If you tried something like this on a towel, it would probably bunch up the fabric and it wouldn't wear well, and it's just too delicate to actually use. So this is a separate type of thing if you want to look up wall hanging embroideries. Also gorgeous. You can get kits on Etsy. There's so many options for that as well. But today we're going to talk about embroidery that you can do on a kitchen towel. So this I love because it's just really functional, really beautiful, something that you can use around your house, give as a gift, and it looks really cool, really unique and homemade. But it's pretty simple. I promise you we're just going to be tracing with a needle and thread. So these are examples of some of the ones I've made. Okay, so let's talk about supplies you'll need to get started. The first thing you're going to need is a blank towel. They come in all sorts of different styles. I really like these ones with a vintage stripe on the sides. They're by the Aunt Martha's brand, and they're a nice quality and pretty affordable. You can get them at craft stores, or Amazon has a really good selection. And I love to pick these with a color that will coordinate with whatever I'm going to be embroidering, match the design, match the holiday, for instance. If it's like Christmas, you can do a red or green stripe, stuff like that. So for our key lime pie towel, I thought it'd be fun to do this with the different shades of green and yellow and orange in there. And we can bring those out in the design. The next thing you'll need is a pattern. So they tend to come in something like this, a little envelope of patterns. You see all the miniature designs on the front, so you get a lot for your buck. This one has at least 7 designs in there. Sometimes there's more, and they come in all cute different themes and all sorts of options. I really like this Aunt Martha's brand. It's like old school classic. This is what we'll be using for today. So I'll show you how we're going to take that out in a second. But just as an example, another one I really like is Stitcher's Revolution. And I'd say this is like a little more fancy, a little more upscale, because they kind of give you some idea of what to do with the color scheme on these. It comes with a little sheet in here that gives you instructions on some stitching, some colors, some color choices. It shows you the patterns in color to give you ideas. Whereas something like the Aunt Martha's is really, really bare bones. You're literally just gonna get an iron-on sheet that folds out like a big newspaper. I've already done this before, so it's been cut open. But folds out in like a big sheet, and you cut out your pattern that you'll be doing and you iron it onto the towel. You can pick up these patterns at pretty much any craft store, Joann's, Michael's, probably Hobby Lobby, Walmart. I think Walmart has like the cheapest ones in their craft section for like 99 cents. They range maybe up to $5 or so, but it's pretty incredible that you get a lot of different patterns for that price. And you can reuse the iron-ons after one time. I have an embroidery friend and we trade used patterns with each other, so it's really nice if you have a friend that also likes to embroider, and it's just so much fun. The next thing you're going to need is the actual thread to embroider with. So that is called embroidery floss, and not sure if you're familiar, but I'll give you a little quick rundown. It's a beautiful, bright, colorful thread, and when you're just getting started, I would really recommend picking up something like this. I got this kit of all these different colors, pretty affordable on Amazon. I love these containers that it comes in with the little compartments. I think it's so satisfying. But you can also just go to the craft store and buy an individual skein of the colors that you want really cheap, and just get a few colors to start with, so totally up to you. But if you do wind up picking up your thread in the skein form like this, I definitely recommend getting some of these little cards to store it on, because if you try just pulling the thread out of here, it's going to be a tangly mess. It just doesn't tend to go well. So the first step would be to take these little labels off, unravel the thread, and wind it onto a little card like this so that it'll come off in a nice, easy manner as you're actually working on your project. Make it so much simpler throughout for you, and just have it ready to go. You can write the little identifier number on there so that if you ever run out, you'll be able to find it again. It's so frustrating if you run out of this thread in the middle of a project and you can't remember what the number was and you can't quite match it perfectly. So always keep track of the number on the label, just this little number right here, so you can always refill a color. You never know when it's going to wind up being your absolutely favorite color or something you use in a long-term project, so it's really important. The only other things you'll need are an embroidery hoop. So this is what holds your fabric taut, so you can really easily sew in and out of it. It's like two circles that clasp together. I'll show you when we get set up. This can be really cute for displaying the finished work in too, like some of those examples I showed you in the beginning if you're not doing a towel. But even no matter what you're working on, you're going to want to hold your work in one of these while you're going. This one's about a 7-inch embroidery hoop, and I think that's a great size for seeing a whole pattern and not having to reposition it constantly to work on different areas of your pattern, but not too big that it's like unwieldy and hard to get around. But these come in all sorts of different sizes if you'd rather start with like just a small surface area that you're working on or anything like that. This is just like a good generic working size. Then you'll need scissors, of course. I always recommend bird-shaped scissors. I mean, it's just so nostalgic, cute little vintage touch. And you really want a nice pair of small scissors. Makes it so much easier to get into the small threads as you're working, and you never know when you're going to need to trim something. And the last supply is just a needle. I'm trying to make sure you can actually see it. I prefer a needle that has a wider eye, so it's a lot easier to thread, because you're going to be constantly rethreading different colors as you go, and that just makes it simpler. You also don't need a super sharp needle for this. Obviously it needs to be able to puncture the towel, but you don't want to accidentally be stabbing yourself. So you can use specifically created embroidery needles that have a bigger eye and they're a little bit more dull. So I will link to all of these supplies and my favorite type of needles to use in the description below. But if you're using like a true sewing needle with a really tiny eye that's meant for just like a single thread, that's going to be pretty frustrating. So you definitely want to invest in a couple of embroidery needles that'll make your process so much more enjoyable. Okay, so we're ready to get going. The first step you're going to want to do is wash and dry your towel, because you don't want to risk that it might shrink on the first wash. And if you've already embroidered it, like your embroidery won't shrink, but your towel will shrink and it won't look right, it won't lay right after that. So this one's already been washed and ironed and ready to go. And then we have the pattern. I actually have a couple sets of this one. I've been working on it for a while, so different pieces are missing from different sets, but we're gonna do this key lime pattern here. So I'm just gonna cut it out. You wanna cut closely to the actual printing so you don't have a ton of extra material to deal with. Although I will say anything you iron onto the towel is going to be there permanently for all intents and purposes. There is a way to erase these iron-ons if they don't go right, but it doesn't tend to fade perfectly. You can use like dish soap, you can leave it in the sun, you can try different things to erase the template. But in general, anything that you iron on is gonna stay, and the only way to hide it is to sew over it. So you really wanna make sure anything in this pattern is something you wanna keep, something you want to actually sew in place. For instance, sometimes it will have some wording. Like with this set, the original idea is that it would be days of the week. Everything is backwards, by the way, because it's going to be ironed face down. So that's going to transfer onto the towel like that. So you kind of have to use a little brain power to figure out what it's going to look like once it's done. But since I'm not doing this as an actual days of the week towel set, I'm going to cut off that word Saturday. So just really keep that in mind as you're preparing to iron it on. Like if you don't want to do this part of the pattern for some reason, you can cut that out because once it's ironed on, you pretty much have to do it. So that's what the pattern is going to look like. Okay, so I have the towel here ready to iron on the pattern. I usually use this little tab as the back half of the towel, and I fold it in half like this because this is kind of like how it would hang over maybe like your stove bar, which is where I usually display my towels. And I try to center it on this half portion of the towel. So I have my cutout pattern, and I'm just going to center it here. The pattern itself will come with instructions on the back. To be honest, I don't follow these exactly perfectly. It says to use a hard surface, not a padded ironing board, but I've always just used my normal ironing board for this, and I've never had any problems with it. I also have my iron preheated. My iron broke, so I can't control the temperature anymore. I really need to replace that. So I don't even know what temperature I iron at, probably like the highest temperature. But you can follow the instructions for your iron and for the pattern. I also pour out all the water, make sure there's no steam. Put the button up to make sure if there were any water in there it wouldn't steam, because that can really mess up the pattern. And then I'm just pre-ironing the fabric again, make sure it's a nice smooth canvas, and also to preheat the fabric if that helps. Supposedly that helps a little bit with the transfer. And now I'm just gonna eyeball getting this centered. So obviously you want to do it face down. And I usually just kind of eyeball what looks centered, and then I use my hand to tell. So like that's about a palm width from the stripes. That side's about a palm width from the stripes. That's like a few fingers from the top. That's like a few fingers from the bottom. And then I look at like anything that should be in a straight line, like the text, and I try to see if that's like parallel with the bottom hem. But I gotta tell you, like, it kind of doesn't matter as much as you think. Like, don't stress too much about this step. Like, it's gonna be fine, you know? Just don't do anything crazy and it'll turn out fine. So I think that's about right. You could pin the pattern in place to be absolutely sure it doesn't budge while you're ironing it. But to be honest, I usually just hold it down myself. So I'll keep one hand on it and then set the iron down. Leave it for a few seconds and then kind of nudge it over. I really would suggest you want to err on the side of like over ironing, obviously not to the point of scorching anything, but it's a real bummer when you take this off and you realize some of the pattern didn't transfer, because you can't go back and do that. Like once it's on there, it's on there. You can't ever line it up perfectly. If you try to re-iron it, it won't line up right. So now I'm just switching to hold it back here, scooting this over, and hopefully that's it. Ta-da! Yay! So now this pattern really has at least another use in it. You'll see after a couple uses it starts to look really faded. And they actually make pencils that you can go over a pattern with to iron on. So I can link that below in the supplies list if you want to make your own patterns that way, or just give new life to an old pattern that way. That's a really cool option. But yeah, we have this ready to go, ready to iron on. And this won't really wash out. This is a permanent pattern, but we'll be covering everything you see with thread. So let's get started on the actual sewing. First step is to put the work into the embroidery hoop. So the piece that has this little metal clasp at the top goes on the front of the work and this goes on the back. But you just twist the little screw at the top to make the circle wider so that you can put it over the frame with the fabric, and then once you have it centered how you want it, you just screw the screw back to tighten it. And it's really helpful to keep your work taut in here because it just makes stitching into the fabric so much easier. So you might have to reposition it, retighten it as you go, but that's very, very simple. And now comes the not as simple part, which is choosing colors. Like I said, I picked kind of a complicated pattern, and I've done this one before. This is how it turned out last time I did it. I did mostly different shades of green for this. Green and pink. I love green and pink together. And it's just a lot of decision making, honestly, with this type of embroidery. Like, it's totally up to you what colors you want to use. If you want to go with realism and make your fork silver like a silver fork would be, or totally crazy and just do your favorite colors. So I'll show you a couple examples. So here's one I've done that is just monochromatic. I stitched the whole pattern in this light blue color. And I think that works really well, especially if you're new to this and you don't want to make a lot of hard color decisions. Looks really cool to do monochromatic or different shades of the same color, which is sort of what I was playing with on this one. I would just kind of caution against having like too much going on. I have some older towels that I don't love that I used like literally every color in the rainbow and different stitching styles. This one even has like some metallic gold. It's totally fine, but it's just not my favorite towel to reach for. I like ones that have like all pastel colors, or like I said, a monochromatic type of theme, or even just 2 strong main colors or 3 strong main colors. I think that tends to look visually a little more appealing, at least for my style. So just some input from me on how you might want to use colors in this. Another thing that can help is to go ahead and pick out your colors in advance so you can kind of see them all together. So I'm going to get an idea of my color scheme for this. Okay, I laid out some colors I think I'll probably use in this, some shades of green and then pink because I love pink, and some orange to bring out the colors in the stripes. So it's just kind of a rough idea. It's nice to have a little color palette in mind, nothing to worry about too much. Okay, so I'm starting with this pink color, no surprise, and one word of wisdom, you don't want to use a very long piece of thread at a time. It's kind of seems easier because then you don't have to change your colors as often, but the longer it is, the more likely you're going to get some tangles. So I would recommend about maybe an arm's length of embroidery floss at a time. The embroidery floss is made of 6 strands, and if you kind of tap the ends of the threads, they'll start to separate into their 6 strands. Hopefully you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Most embroidery is done with either 2 or 3 strands, so it kind of depends on how bold of a look you want to have, but we'll use 3 strands for this. So that means you're going to separate 3 individual strands. It doesn't work to grab 3 of these and try to pull them out. It's just going to tangle the floss. So you hold the whole thing steady, you pick out the 1 strand, and then you go ahead and pull that out, which leaves the rest of the strands all coiled up there. So I'm going to do that 3 times so that I have the right amount of thread. And it's just, as long as you hold the rest of it steady, it shouldn't tangle up while you do this. Kind of wants to tangle up, actually. There we go. That released the 2nd strand, and 1 more. So now I'm left with the original floss, which just has 3 strands in it. You can smooth that out and use that as is. And then the other 3 individual strands, I can just line those up and use them as 1 piece of thread now. So now you want to take all 3 of these strands and thread them into your needle as one. That's why I recommend a needle with a bigger eye. Make this a little bit more painless on you. You can also use a needle threader. So these come in all sorts of different styles, but basically it's a little wire shape that you put through the eye of the needle, and then you put the thread through that wire, and when you pull it back out, and the needle is threaded. So pretty much any sewing kit will have like a very basic version of that in there. Then once you have your needle threaded, you're going to pull the 2nd half of the thread through till you have almost like doubled. That way as you work, you can keep adjusting the length of the thread that you have available. And for this kind of embroidery, we're going to tie a knot so that the fabric holds the back of the thread in place. So I like to just do a simple little double knot like what we were taught in school. 2 little basic knots on top of each other. Very simple, but it's thick enough that it won't pop through the fabric and it will stay on the back side. So I'm going to start on this plate right here, and we're going to be using the stitch called back stitch. It's called that because you basically put the needle up through the fabric and then you go back a length. So you see I came up here about 1 stitch into where I want it, and now I'm going to go back and put it down to create the first stitch. So that's what it looks like on the front. And here's what we have going on the back. It's really important to always be aware of the back of your work as you're going, so I'll talk about this throughout, but you, especially on a project like this where it's a towel that people are going to see the back of your work, you want to try to keep the back looking as tidy as possible. So we'll talk about that as we go. But on to the next stitch. I'm going to do the same thing, put my needle in about a stitch length from where I just was. And you can just eyeball it if you really want to have nice professional looking stitches. The more even, the more equidistant that you can make them, the better. So just make your first stitch kind of small and then eyeball it to keep matching it. And it's not going to be perfect, and that is okay. That's what makes handmade things so special. And that's why this is going to be worth priceless more than anything you could get at the Target dollar section that's mass made perfect embroidery or something like that. So you just keep bringing the needle up a stitch length away, coming back and setting it back through from the top. And I like this stitch because I think it's the fastest stitch, first of all, which we have a lot of detail on this towel, so that's going to be helpful. But it also just has a nice clean look to it, especially as you get a hang of it, get a little more used to making your stitches the exact same size, it'll really start to look nice. So as I go, I'm just going to be aware of what's going on in the back. I have those extra little threads from where I tied the knot, and I'm going to go ahead and trim those a little shorter so they don't cause any mayhem. They can get tangled up, or they could start to poke through to the front of the project. So something else to keep an eye on as you're going. As you stitch a certain amount, the thread that you have doubled up will start to be the same length as the thread you're working with. So if you're not paying attention when that happens, you might accidentally start stitching with 6 strands of thread instead of 3 because it got doubled up, and then you'll have to go back a few stitches to free it. So I'm just going to pull the thread through a little bit more so that I have a shorter tail and keep giving myself a little more thread to work with as I go throughout. And that will make it nice and easy to manage a nice length of thread without it getting tangled up. I'm sure it will still get tangled up at some point, and I'll show you how to handle it when that happens. But for now, we're just going to book through the rest of this cute little pink plate. Now, my stitches are kind of getting longer as I go, which is just sort of honestly like a lazy thing that happens. It just gets easier to make them longer, take fewer stitches, and I'm not too happy with that, so I'm going to go ahead and undo it. I think the easiest way to undo a stitch is to take the needle off of the thread. Kind of a pain, but that way you can just pull the stitch up from the front of the fabric. Rip it right out. I'm going to take out the last 2 stitches and rethread my needle, and then think again about how I am spacing the stitches so that they can try to look a bit more uniform. Also, my fabric gets a little bit slack in the hoop as I go, so I'm just tightening that by pulling it down on all the sides. Also, just wanted to mention one thing that's a little bit of a hassle when you're working on a towel is you have all this extra fabric that can easily get in the way. I'll sometimes just kind of drape it over the top of my embroidery hoop to get it out of the way. because you do want to be careful that it doesn't double up behind the work. And it's easier than you would think to accidentally start stitching through 2 layers of fabric and not realize you're sewing the towel to itself. So it kind of helps to just hold any excess material out of the way as much as possible. Okay, so I've sewed the whole outline of our little plate, and I'm going to do these details on the plate also in pink. So the last place that my thread went is here. This is what the back of the work is looking like, by the way. Just a simple, clean line so far. And you never want to hop your thread very far. So for instance, I wouldn't want to go like all the way over here and sew something over here now, because then I'd have a big piece of thread hanging on the back of my work. It just doesn't look great, and it could kind of mess up the stitches. But since my next thing I'm going to sew is only right about here, it's not a big distance to leapfrog my thread, and that should be okay. So just keep that in mind. Sometimes you're going to have to cut the thread and start over. Sometimes you can just go from there. So that's my next stitch, and as you can see, not a big leap at all on the back. And for these details, I'm just going to do a single long stitch. Another stitch that I could do here would be a daisy stitch, but I'm not going to make this video 18 hours long by showing a bunch of different stitches. But if you are interested in learning other stitches, you can look up daisy stitch also on YouTube. I'm sure somebody has done it. But now we're going to do back stitch here, and I just want to make sure I'm showing back stitch really clearly, so I'm going to do this really slow. I'm going to bring my needle from the back of the fabric to the front, about a stitch from where I want the stitch to start, a stitch length from where I want the stitch to start. So you kind of have to do trial and error to figure out exactly where that's going to be with your needle. I'm going to bring that up, pull my thread all the way through, and then back stitch, go back to the beginning of the stitch and put it from the front back through the back. So that's what creates that simple little stitch. And then you just want to try to mirror that length-ish if you can. It's really not my strong suit. My stitches are kind of random sometimes. But trial and error, just poke around and find about a stitch length away on the line. Pull it from the back to the front. Go back down right in there, that same hole that you made with the last stitch. Pull it through, and that's a back stitch. So on this part, I'm just going to be tracing along the pattern. I actually think straight lines are some of the hardest things to backstitch, because you're essentially drawing a straight line out of a bunch of tiny lines. So if all your little tiny lines are crooked, your long line isn't going to look very straight. So it's not always the most forgiving stitch on a lot of straight lines, but something like this with a little shape to it is really fun to do with backstitch. And if you are struggling with straight lines, okay, what I just did there is kind of a mess. I just made like 2 tiny stitches together for no reason. But I think I'm going to leave it, let it be one of the little imperfections. Let's see how bad it looks when I finish that off. It's okay, it's definitely like a little imperfection there. But I was going to say, if you're struggling with getting straight lines, you might want to try stem stitch. That's another type of stitch that you could look up. That's the one I was showing you that looks like a little bit raised off of the fabric, and I find that to be a lot more forgiving for straight lines. But again, we're doing backstitch in this video. I think it's the fastest and simplest stitch, and a really good one to start with. And really all you need to know, you could do towels to your heart's content with just backstitch. So one thing you can see that's happening here is my thread is starting to twist up on itself. And that is a red flag. When you see that happening, that's a good time to call your attention to your project, because when your thread is getting twisted, it starts to want to tangle. So I'm going to go ahead and finish that stitch, pulling the thread slowly so it doesn't tangle. And then you just want to hold your work up and let the thread dangle with the needle at the end and unwind itself. Because when that starts to happen, your thread is getting twisted. With each stitch, you're making like a little twist in the thread and winding it up, and you're going to get a lot more knots if you don't do that periodically. It's really important. Alright, so the thread has gotten pretty short. As you can see, I've used all of it up except for this little tail. And you want to be aware of that and tie it off before it gets too short to tie off, which would be very frustrating. It's annoying when you can't just finish what you set out to finish without changing thread, but it's better to err on the side of not running out because you need to tie a knot. So I'm just going to finish the stitch on the front of the fabric, pull it to the back like usual, and then flip it over and just tie a knot. So the way I do it is just run the needle under the most recent, or maybe the second most recent stitch, and then pull it through. That's going to create this little loop here, and tuck the thread back through the loop to make the knot. Pull it tight, and I'm going to do two so that it's a little bit of a double knot right there. Same thing, go under the thread, pull it through, pull through the loop, and make sure and scooch the knot down as close as possible to the fabric. So that ties it off. So with this type of embroidery, you just trim the extra thread from the back, and you want to make it short enough that it's not going to cause any problems and get knotted up with your next thread, but you also don't want to make it so short that it might untie itself from the knot or have any problems with unraveling. So I just leave a little tail about that length, and then we're good to start the whole process over. Alright, so the way you'll notice when a knot happens is that you go to pull the thread through the front and it doesn't come as far as you thought it would. Also, I see like all 6 strands are stuck and not coming through. So I turn it over and there's this little wadded up knot back here. So don't panic. Most knots can be untangled pretty easily. You just kind of want to see what you're working with. So that one is literally just that the tail of the thread was twisted up in the rest of the thread. I'm sure we'll get a real doozy of a knot soon, but sometimes it's that simple. If you don't panic, you can just kind of separate it like that. But we will see what happens when there's a real knot, so you know what to do. Alright, actually it's already giving me trouble again. Probably means I should be untwisting this thread more often than I am. And it just has this little knot here on the front. Same thing, I can just kind of gently, carefully pick at it and it'll come apart. But that's definitely a cue for me to let this thread untwist. And just like that, we have the whole plate done. So since I still have some pink thread on my needle, I'm going to go ahead and move to another part that I plan to do in pink, which is the words key lime pie at the top. And same exact thing, I tied off the thread here, I tied a new knot in the remaining thread, and I'm just going to start over up here and do that rather than dragging my thread all the way across and having that problem that we talked about. So it just keeps it a lot cleaner looking on the back of your work when you do that. And also you can kind of see through the front. If there is a thread traveling a long distance, it makes like a shadow on the front of the work too. So that is why you always want to cut that off. I'm going to jump over to the dot and the eye and show you the only other kind of stitch that you need to know, which is a French knot, and that is useful for making just like a little dot. So you bring your thread up where you want the dot to be, and then you hold it taut and you use the needle to kind of like scoop under the thread twice. So it's wrapped around the needle twice like that, and keep holding everything taut to the side, and then just put the needle back in basically the same spot or like slightly next to it, holding that thread taut, and use your finger to hold it flat, and then just slowly pull the thread through the back of the towel. So basically you're just creating a knot on purpose, and it makes this perfect little dot on the eye there. So I can show you that again when we get to a different part of the fabric that's going to have another dot in the pattern. You can also look up plenty of YouTube tutorials that are just on a French knot stitch to see exactly how to do it, but it's really that simple. You're just going to wrap the thread around like I showed you, and as long as you're sure to do it really slowly, it should work out where you get the knot where you want it. You don't want to get the knot in the wrong place. And then I'm just going right back to doing my back stitch, moving on with the rest of this pattern. Well, everything is coming along pretty smoothly. I've done some of the pie. Now I'm coming down here to fill in this embellishment in orange. And as soon as I get another knot or something useful to show you, I will be sure to do that with you. But for now, I'm just kind of cruising along and very cozy. I was going to mention that the reason this is my favorite hobby is it is just really relaxing, cozy, comforting hobby. I always have a blanket. This blanket is so soft and comfy. I always have a candle lit. It's just a really relaxing time because your hands are occupied, and so you're not on your phone, you're not looking at anything stressful on like social media or the news. I just think it's really healthy to have a hobby like this. So I just like to enjoy kind of relaxing, and if you're with other people, it's really nice to do because you can have a nice conversation while you're sewing. It's not like being on your phone where, you know, you can't focus on a conversation. This is pretty mindless. You're literally just tracing in little pieces like I showed you. So I love to just like sit with my husband and do this, or friends, or watch a movie, like something you're not too invested in so you don't have to look at the screen constantly. I'll do this like while my husband's watching a movie that he's interested in. But it's just a really nice, comforting hobby. So I think I'll just sew along here for a little bit. Hopefully you can get some of the relaxing atmosphere that embroidery brings just from this video, and especially once you start doing it yourself. And I'll let you know next time I have something come up that will help you in your learning. But for now, we can just relax and enjoy. Okay, so this is where it stands. I'm filming this over several different little sessions, by the way. I think embroidery is a lot more enjoyable when you just kind of do a little bit to relax at a time and don't slog through a whole complicated pattern all at once, because it can just kind of suck the fun out of it, I feel like. Another good idea when you are resting between work on the project is to take the hoop out. With something like this that's going to go in the washer and get ironed, it's like not as essential, but if you're ever working with like maybe a more delicate fabric or something, you really don't want to get like permanent hoop marks in your fabric. So always a good practice to take out the hoop when you're letting it rest. Another thing that you should be religious about is always knowing where your needle is at all times. Because I have lost a needle and I have stepped on a needle, and I don't recommend any of that. So I'm pretty religious that when I'm not sewing, I have my needle just stuck through my extra fabric. I always use the stripe on the lower left side if I'm doing a towel. Like, that's just my mental, okay, I know exactly where my needle is, because these things are sharp enough to hurt yourself or someone. You don't want to do that. But one other thing I wanted to mention is that you want to make sure you're always working on your project with clean hands. So I always wash my hands with soap before I come to work on a project. And like, if you're wearing makeup, try to be really conscious of not touching your face while you're working, because then you could get foundation on your fingers and then transfer it onto the fabric. Again, it's slightly less of a concern with something like this, that I'm going to throw this whole thing in the washing machine once I'm done, and I'll show you how to wash these. But especially if you're working with like a wall hanging, something that you can't just throw it in the washer, you really want to be careful not to ever stain that fabric, because that would be very unfortunate. So we have a little knot here. I'm kind of hoping it's going to be a trickier one to demonstrate. But I'm just going to, first step is to kind of pull it away from the work and see what you're dealing with. Basically, this is a textbook knot. It's like a little loop that has formed with sort of a double knot looking base. And the tricky thing with these is they usually will come apart if you put your needle in the loop, like so, and then gently pull on it. And I'm trying that, and that is not working. Okay, so it's not that kind of knot. It doesn't seem to want to unravel. The next thing I would try is to take just one strand instead of all 3 loops and see if just pulling on one of the strands helps at all. You have to be really careful. You don't want to break your thread. You don't want this to set back. That's not working, so I'm going to try tugging at the thread itself. That's not working. So the next thing I would try is to put my needle into the base of the knot and see if I can loosen it up that way. So I'm just kind of wriggling my needle in. This color thread is probably not the easiest for you to see, but hopefully you have an idea of what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, everything I just did really tightened up the knot, but it was worth trying because sometimes that unravels more easily. Okay, I don't know what I did. It's actually pretty rare that there's a tangle I can't untie, but this knot does not want to budge. I tried all my usual tricks, and I don't think I'm getting anywhere. Which is kind of good, so I can show you if, heaven forbid, this happens to you. It's rarely does happen. You have a few options. One is if you can force it through the fabric, you could hide it on the back. So you see with a little extra effort, oh sorry if that wasn't on camera, with a little extra effort I popped it to the back of the work. So now I have it here. So one option, and I think this is probably what I'm going to do, is keep sewing until this is right up against the back and then just basically hide it in the back of the work. It's not like a super ugly knot, it's just that little loop, and it will fit through the weave of the fabric if I force it with each stitch. So I think that's going to be my best bet. You got to be careful because you don't want to break your thread. You don't want to make a big hole or tear in the fabric, so like use your best judgment if it feels doable to do what I'm doing. The other option would have been to cut the fabric, or to cut the thread there, take out a few stitches so I had enough of a tail to make a knot and tie it off properly, and then start fresh with a fresh thread. So those are your 2 escape routes in the case of a knot that just truly won't untangle like this one. But as you can see, with just a few stitches, I'm almost to the point of being able to hide it. And then you just need to kind of time it out such that the knot is on the back. So I'm just going to go this next stitch, not force that knot through. And now you can see it's just going to live right there. So it's not ideal, but it's really not a huge deal. And I can just keep sewing from here. Okay, we've got another knot. Let's see what we're working with here. I think this is just a case where I really should have been untwisting my thread and I wasn't. So it doesn't have a loop to it, but I'm just going to stick my needle into the actual knot and hopefully it's going to come untwisted. Okay, I don't know if my zoom picked that up, but I just kind of worked my needle into it and it popped out like a magic trick. There's no knot anymore. When that happens, you want to like hold it while it goes back through because obviously the thread is pretty twisted. But there we go, we made it. So now I can let my thread unwind. I'm back, this time with another knot. And if you can see, it's that same type of knot that tends to happen where you have a little loop and then a knot. So I'm hoping this will be the typical one that comes apart when you put your needle through the little loop and you like wriggle the needle. That tightens the knot on the needle. And you just do that until the knot is all the way up to the base there. And then you can take the needle out, pull at the 2 pieces of the thread, and it just pops right apart. Checking back in, things are shaping up. I did the pie. I went with like just realism on the pie, like a graham cracker crust color and white for the whipped cream. Doesn't show up that well, but I love using white. I don't know why, it's just fun. So the only thing left is this fork and this coffee cup, and I'm now met with crippling indecision, which is part of the process because we have to pick the colors for all of this stuff. I went with doing the orange coffee cup, and then I think I'm just gonna do the saucer pink. That's like the last thing on this whole towel, which is just 2 little lines here, and so I thought we should do that together. So it's been so fun to sew this with you. And that's the last stitch. I always feel like the last stitch is special. So I just have to tie that off. Same way we've done it on all these other colors. So I'll pop it out of the hoop so that you can see the final color scheme and everything. I think it turned out so fun. It looks really summery, which is perfect because I'm doing this in the summertime. So I know it's scary when you just worked so hard to embroider something and you're just throwing it in the wash, but it will be okay, I promise. I truly just throw my embroidered towels in the normal laundry like with other linens. I do wash them on cold, and I'm doing this one on gentle, but honestly I often just throw it in on normal and they do great, and I throw them in the dryer on normal and they have always held up really well. So I'm just gonna wash and dry and show you what's next. And when I iron my vintage embroidery pieces, I'm very, very careful. I usually only iron it from the back of the piece, and I just go very delicately over the stitch work. But honestly, with my own embroidery, I feel like it can take the iron. The only thing that can get a little bit weird are French knots, those little dots that we did. So I try not to like go over those too much, and maybe just press straight down on those parts. But otherwise, you really just wash, dry, and iron these like normal. It's very handy. Yay, I love it. It's so pretty. You guys, thank you so much for joining me. If you stuck through the whole tutorial, I'm so impressed with you. I know you can do this, and I think you might really, really love it. So you deserve to give yourself the shot at trying. But you deserve a hobby that you love, that brings you comfort and joy and peace and serenity. I just think this is truly such a peaceful, cozy activity at any time of year. Hit subscribe. I'm gonna do a giveaway for this very towel in my next video. So hit subscribe if you want to be sure to catch me for that, and hopefully you can win this and have a little piece of my artistry and discover your own artistry through this video and through the giveaway. So thank you so much for joining. I hope I'll get to see you soon, and have a wonderful day. Bye.